Now, something we talked about in another video was the imputation of Adam's sin and the way that relates to the work of Christ. And certainly Romans 5 is an important text in that regard. You covered the imputation of Adam's sin and what Paul says about that in your chapter. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, under the section Curriculum of Sin, I have a number of subsections, and one of them is the entrance of sin. And I deal for a couple of pages on Romans 12 and the whole debate there about how you interpret that verse and that paragraph.
You mean Romans 5:12?
Sorry. I deal with that in Romans 5:12 and also the whole paragraph and a couple of pages on that. And I find Augustine and Murray very helpful in that regard. And that's really the key to understanding how we ourselves are sinful. We have descended from Adam genealogically, so there's a realistic sense in which we're sinners. We have inherited his sinful nature just by being biologically connected to him. But the Bible teaches that primarily the way that we are sinful and guilty is not by that realistic connection to Adam biologically, but federally, covenantally. The way God set the world up was that through one man's obedience or disobedience, we would be made either disobedient or obedient in him. And when Adam sinned, he didn't sin as a private citizen, he sinned as a public man in office. He was representing us as the head of the covenant of works. And so that's how we have become sinners. That's how sin has entered the world, through the giant man Adam. The good news is that there's another giant man, Christ, and through our faith union to him, we can have his righteousness imputed to us and our sins forgiven. So Christ really comes to do not what the first Adam failed to do, but what the first Adam should have achieved for us. It's more than just making up for what Adam did wrong. It's actually achieving what he ought to have done, and that is the credited righteousness under the law that can be given to us. And so that's what I deal with in Romans chapter 5:12 through to 21. I have a whole section on the entrance of sin and the imputation of Adam's sin to us.
Does Thomas Goodwin have a quote that helps here?
He does, and it's a lovely quote. Thomas Goodwin said, "In God's sight, there are two men, Adam and Jesus Christ, and these two men have all other men hanging from their girdle strings."
Which means, what's the girdle string?
Well, it was, the strings off the robe maybe of the high priest. And so the image I give is two giants with a big belt around their waist with hooks and people attached to the hooks. And wherever that giant goes, or whatever he does, if that giant trips and falls, everyone attached to his belt trips and falls with him. And so that's the image that Goodwin was giving us. And if you grasp that image of the two giants, Adam and Christ, and people connected to them, that is really the architectonic structure of the whole Bible. The two Adam structure that really helps you understand sin, and it helps you understand the gospel as well.
Well, before we conclude, tell me about some of the other New Testament insights from this part of the book.
Well, there's chapters on the Gospels, on Johannine literature, and you have a chapter on the Catholic epistles minus some of the Johannine literature. So maybe you can tell us what you looked at in Hebrews and 1st and 2nd Peter and Jude.
Well, one of the things you see in Hebrews is, I think it's really helpful, is sin is deceitful, and Paul talks in a similar way. But I think remembering that the deceitfulness of sin, it promises us life but does not bring life, brings death, is really helpful. That's in Hebrews 3 and 4, that section, one of the warning passages of Hebrews. And you talked in a previous video about the sinlessness of Christ. You also see that in Hebrews, our great high priest, who is sinless and provides the answer to our sin. And so where Hebrews talks about sin, it also talks about the answer via the high priesthood of Christ. Another place that's important is James, chapter 1, verses 13 to 15, where he talks about the way that our hearts lead us to sin. We see, we desire, we want, He gives us, not quite quoting it there, but instead of yielding life, that yields death, which again relates to that deceptiveness of sin and the deathliness of sin that we are warned against. And in contrast to that, in that same context there in James 1, every good and perfect gift comes from above, versus the sin which does not actually produce good gifts in us. There's a number of other places. 2 Peter is another text that has a lot to say about sin. But these are just some snapshots into Hebrews and the Catholic epistles, and what Paul has to say about sin is really of a piece with the entire New Testament. Even though you're going to find distinctive among the literature.
I think what I found editing the chapters was reading all the biblical sections and seeing a lovely unity of thought among the contributors, but really among the New Testament authors, that whilst they all have their different focuses or foci and different ways of putting the doctrine of sin, they all at the end of the day are saying the same thing, and saying there's also the same answer to sin. But that became very clear as I sort of read through those biblical chapters, especially in the New Testament section, to see the unity of the doctrine of sin. So while we talk about a Pauline doctrine of sin or a Johannine doctrine of sin, really what we're talking about is a Christian doctrine of sin.
Maybe one other question that comes up that some might have is, one of the classic proof texts of sinfulness comes from Genesis 6. And that's an interesting passage. Is that covered in this book, and is that related to some of the debates about what's going on in Genesis 6?
We covered in our introduction, that text, Genesis 6:5, every intention of the thought of the heart was only evil continually. We think there's 4 aspects there. It covers the totality of sin, it covers the intensity of sin, the intention of the thoughts of the heart. It covers the extensity of sin, only evil, all of the intentions of the thoughts of the heart, and the constancy of sin, continually. So the totality, intensity, extensity, constancy. So we touch on that in our introduction, and then Will Wood in his chapter on the Pentateuch, as he deals with sin in the early chapters of the Bible, he deals quite extensively with Genesis 6 and the context there.
Well, and if those who are watching aren't quite sure what that refers to, maybe they can pick up the book and look at it. So the book is called Ruined Sinners to Reclaim, edited by Jonathan and David Gibson. It's published by Crossway, and so I invite you to pick up a copy and be edified by it. So Johnny, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for watching. I hope this has been helpful. Remember to keep it clear and focus on Christ.